I'm sure if you asked most people in the United States in 1957 what city came to mind when they thought of the United Kingdom, most, if not all, would probably say London. Certainly not Liverpool. Liverpool is historically known as a very blue-collar city, through and through. Though it saw action during the early days of World War II as the German Air Force air raided the city nearly 80 times, throughout its history it was always just a town that was comprised of industrial workers, sailors, immigrants. But from this town, Liverpool, two teenage boys, one an art student who spent most of his adolescence getting into trouble, the other a quiet kid whose mother had just died a year prior. In 1957, they met and both bonded over their love for American rock music and had a burning desire to play their music, the music that they loved. The one, John, was told by his aunt, well, the guitar's all very well, but you'll never make a living out of it. The other, Paul, struggled to even play the guitar before he realized he could play it left-handed by reversing the order of the strings. All right, so I know I don't have to go any further for many of you to realize that these two young men, along with George and Richard, but we all know him as Ringo, would become the greatest and most influential band of all time, the Beatles, known for the last 60 years across all continents. But think about this for a moment. How many people back in 1957 in the United States ever heard of John, Paul, George, and Ringo? These guys came out of nowhere from an unlikely part of the UK, and yet their huge impact on music, art, literature, fashion, social movements, and pop culture as a whole is undeniable, but they were unlikely and unheard of at one point. At one point, they were obscure and insignificant in the eyes of the general public, but then grew to this meteoric fame, and their work still is influential to this day. Now, contrary to what John Lennon joked in 1966, no one has influenced the world more than Jesus and his kingdom. And yet, how did it all begin? Not all of Jesus' parables were these full-fledged stories. Some of the shortest ones were stated in straightforward, simple form. If you have your Bibles, I want us to go ahead and let's open Matthew chapter 13, and we're going to go ahead and begin reading in verse 31 through verse 32. And it reads, "He put another parable before them, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.'" Let's go ahead and stop there. So as we've been doing with all the parables so far, we first addressed the background, right? The surrounding context of this particular parable, which is the same as the previous week and the week before, as we're still in chapter 13. Jesus is in Galilee preaching to a large audience made up of different hearts, different responses. Now let's go ahead and dive into the narrative itself of the parable. What does Jesus compare the kingdom of heaven to in this parable? He says a mustard seed. Just a disclaimer, there's always someone who is like, wait a second. The mustard seed is not the smallest seed. Now remember, Jesus is speaking generally here. He's not giving a lecture on botany or teaching a gardening class at a local co-op. All of his parables in this section are agricultural in nature, and the imagery would have been taken from his audience's understanding and perspective of agriculture. The mustard seed is a very, very small seed, and to Jesus' audience would have been the smallest seed frequently encountered in their agricultural communities in Galilee. For the day-to-day farmer in Galilee, this was probably the smallest seed they would plant. The mustard plant of Palestine was very different from the one we're often familiar with, which is theirs was black in color. In the Middle East and among Jewish rabbis, it was used as a proverbial object for smallness or insignificance. What happens when it grows, though, in this parable? Jesus said it grows larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree. It wasn't unusual for the small seed to grow into a 10 to 12 foot high tree, and its branches would sprawl out wide. These trees grew alongside the shore of Galilee, of the Sea of Galilee, and would have been in view of Jesus' audience who were along the shore of the sea. It was also a common sight to see these mustard trees and bushes surrounded by and dwelled by birds, because the birds would often eat the little black seeds that budded at the end of the branches. So now, we looked at the narrative itself. There has to be a main point though, right? Jesus' objective in his teaching, and in this parable, he wants them to understand something important. Let's go ahead and look at the main point. What's he comparing? Again, what's he comparing with this mustard seed? He says the kingdom. Was the kingdom a foreign concept to his hearers? No. The Old Testament is saturated with prophecies about the kingdom, but was many of their understanding of the nature of the kingdom very, very different than what Jesus was explaining? Oh, absolutely. The Jews, they looked forward to the Messiah and his kingdom. It was their hope. They cherished it. All throughout the prophets of the Old Testament, they longed for the coming of the kingdom. In Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, Jacob blessed each of his sons who would become the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. There, in that context, Jacob foretold that from the tribe of Judah, one would come who would reign over the entire world. He says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of all the peoples." In 1 Chronicles chapter 17 and verse 11 through 14, we read of a prophecy that the Jews saw as foreshadowing the coming of the Messiah. This is where God tells David that for one of David's sons or descendants, God is going to establish his kingdom, and this future descendant will build a house for God, and God will establish his throne forever. In Daniel 2:44, Daniel describes the kingdom as being an everlasting kingdom that should never be shaken, that will never be shaken. So how would the audience of Jesus understand the kingdom? See, the world that Jesus' audience lived in was one they didn't find comfort in. Their people had been scattered for nearly 500 years all over the world. Their former earthly kingdom of Israel, like the one that existed in the days of King David, no longer existed. Some of their people began to forget their roots and customs and adopt the culture of the Gentiles, taking on Gentile names, speaking the Greek language. They were oppressed by the ruling government, the Roman Empire. These people longed for the Messiah to come swiftly and mightily and help them rise up, eradicate the Romans from their homeland, destroy these Gentile pagan nations, bring all their scattered people back home to Mount Zion, and restore their earthly kingdom to its former glory. This was their ethos. If you read Jewish literature from this period, or even some of the writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was the atmosphere and the way the people thought when it came to the kingdom. So when Jesus claimed to be the Messiah and proclaimed the coming of his kingdom, rather than comparing the kingdom to something big or powerful like the Roman legions, he compares it to this itty-bitty little seed. So many of his hearers probably scratch their heads thinking, this is it? From the human perspective, the origin of the kingdom was small and insignificant. Just think about how they, on a surface level perspective, saw Jesus. After Jesus is going to finish his parable at the end of Matthew chapter 13, in verse 55, and in Luke's account in Luke 4 and verse 22, they dismissed his teachings and rejected him, saying, wait, hold on a second. Isn't this the carpenter's son, Joseph? Isn't this his son? Christ, the king of the kingdom, had none of those qualities that are associated normally with the establishment of powerful empires. He didn't come into the world like a bull in a china shop. He didn't amass a physical military to organize a coup. He didn't enter into politics. He wasn't a military general hardened by physical battle whose men swore an undying allegiance to him. You know, the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 53 and verse 2 tells us that Jesus grew up like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. On the surface, he was average and seemed unlikely to survive. Even how he came was contrary to what the Jews expected. They believed, this is how they perceived it, they believed the Messiah would come in this visually spectacular fashion and immediately deliver Israel from their oppressors. But instead, he came in the form of an infant. And well, infants even have to grow just before they begin to take their first steps, right? So how would this infant fulfill their immediate desire of overthrowing the Roman Empire? If you're going to be a king, maybe being in royalty and fine raiment coming from the capital city of Jerusalem would be fitting. Jesus was born in a stable in Bethlehem and grew up in a backwater town called Nazareth, a town not known for fine, cultured, intelligent people. Nazareth was the kind of place that the only way you'd find it is if you were actually looking for it. Blink twice riding by on a camel and you probably miss it. It was insignificant, even in Galilee. Archaeologists believed it probably only had maybe about 400 people, and of that, the majority were extended families. You remember in John chapter 1, and verse 45 to 46, how this guy Philip, he comes running to another guy named Nathanael saying, hey, we found the Messiah, the promised one, the one promised by Moses and the prophets. Guess what? He's from Nazareth. And Nathanael scratches his head and he says, Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? You'd have thought that initially the Messiah would have aligned himself immediately with the Jewish scholars of the day, right? Like Gamaliel, or he would have entered into the schools of Hillel or Shammai, the Harvard and Yale of Judaism in those days. But even the Jews were amazed in John 7 and verse 15 that Jesus had no formal rabbinical training. He wasn't physically rich or came from wealth. He worked with his hands. He was a carpenter. And then take his followers. Let's look at them. What kind of men were they? Were they the well-trained, cultured religious leaders or politicians? Remember in Acts 4 and verse 13, when Peter and John, they're speaking before the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin. The leaders themselves looked at these apostles. And how did they see them? As uneducated common men. In Matthew chapter 4, we read of Jesus recruiting his earliest disciples, and we learn that they're fishermen by trade. Now, here's the thing about fishermen in that day. Fishermen weren't the most poor, but they certainly weren't rich. They made up the lower middle class, and they were educated not beyond the age of 13. Then you jump to Matthew chapter 9. He calls Matthew, a tax collector, the most despised occupation in Palestine, seen as traitors to the Jewish people, to be one of his disciples. These were 12 ordinary, unlikely men in the eyes of the general public. Even his death was unlike anything they could ever envision the Messiah going through. He was put to death in the prime of his youth, in the most inglorious, humiliating death possible in the ancient world. When an earthly king dies, that usually marks the end of their reign. Jesus began proclaiming his ministry 3 years prior to this. So to the eyes of the Jewish people, this is what you have. You have a poor Galilean carpenter surrounded by a ragtag group of average Joes and misfits, followed by orphans, widows, women, disabled people, Gentiles, and his reign's already cut short. Because, well, remember, in their eyes, the obviously more powerful Roman Empire managed to have him crucified, and then all those followers, including his closest disciples, they all flee and hide, and they return back to their previous occupations. Well, so much for King Jesus and his kingdom. And the list goes on of how Jesus didn't meet their fleshly perspectives, expectations. All they could think was, really? Him? He's the fulfillment of God's promises? In short, from the human viewpoint, the religion of Jesus had little chance to succeed. It should have died and faded into obscurity. From a human perspective, Jesus' kingdom was doomed from the start. According to the people, it didn't even have the right king, didn't have the right followers, the right message. It was a small mustard seed. Then you look at the rest of the New Testament. The New Testament's main premise is that Jesus is the one whom the reality of the scripture promises is founded, even in unlikely ways. Those who believed in him had difficulty recognizing the fulfillment of promises in his person and in his ministry. If Jesus really was the Messiah King, where was his kingdom? When would it really be seen in power? See, their definition of power was different than what God actually did. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20 wrote, "For all the promises of God find their yes in him." In other words, if you were to take all the promises of God to the Jews in the Old Testament and ask the question, is Jesus the answer to those promises? You can mark each of them with the answer yes. Paul in Acts 13 and verse 32-33 taught his Jewish people in the synagogue, saying, "And we bring you the good news, the gospel, that what God promised to our fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus." Paul himself, before becoming a Christian, probably had to wrestle with a lot of this himself. Jesus, really? Him? And yet Paul and the many Jews we find following Jesus began to look at the scriptures and remove their biased lens, something that many of us still struggle with when we read the Bible. And they saw the things that were true about Jesus. There's a book called Knowing Jesus Through the Old Testament. The writer there, Christopher Wright, gives an awesome list of the things the Jews that followed Jesus saw as promises to their people from God that were fulfilled in Jesus. For one, he was the singular seed of Abraham, through whom that seed would become universal and multinational. He was the one through whom people of all nations would be blessed, right? He was the Passover lamb protecting God's people from his wrath. His death, burial, resurrection had achieved the new Exodus. He's the mediator of a new covenant. His sacrificial death and life fulfilled and surpassed all that were signified in the tabernacle, the sacrifices, and the priesthood. He was the one in whom we now have an inheritance, greater even than Israel's in the Old Testament, their inheritance of land. This inheritance that we have that cannot be robbed or lost. He's the temple not made with human hands. He is the Mount Zion, the place of the name and presence of God. He is the son of David, but his messianic kingship was concealed behind the basin and towel of servanthood and obedience unto death. He was unlike everything they expected, but he was everything God promised and everything they needed. And then suddenly, that mustard seed grew and it flourished. Historians will tell you there is not a single organization in the ancient world that was multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, and included people of all social classes until Christianity came on the scene. It was a different kind of movement. And in most of the society, if you wanted to change the world, it started in the Senate, it started in the religious councils, but instead it started with an unlikely group from a very insignificant province in the Roman Empire. It doesn't take long to read through the book of Acts and see the prophecies, unprecedented growth of the kingdom, the church. Paul writes in Romans chapter 10 and verse 18, "Their voice has gone out to all the earth and their words to the ends of the world." The kingdom, like that mustard seed, grew, and its branches spread far and wide. It was gradual, but over time, man, you couldn't help but notice its impact it was making. There's this best-selling book that's come out recently entitled Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. It's written by a secular writer, Tom Holland. Not the Spider-Man Tom Holland, but PhD Tom Holland. And although some of the book is critical in how, quote-unquote, Christianity was lived out in the Middle Ages up to the modern era, the book, though, the author points out that first century Christianity grew out of a world that was actually really, really brutal. Christianity contradicted the ancient worldview on so many levels, and he points out that from the movement of Christianity, the world was changed forever. That many concepts today to us, whether Christian or not, those of us that are Christians or those that are not, these concepts that may seem self-evident, but weren't in the days that Jesus came on the scene. Just to list a few, Christianity has changed the way the world sees the formation of universal human rights, the ending of slavery, the concept of caring for the poor as a primary responsibility of those in power, ending widespread slavery, ending human sacrifice. Even the secularist writer argues that Christianity is essential to Western thought, as well as progressing the world in the right direction. Ultimately, we know Christianity is more than what this author presumes it to be, but it's not just a pillar for social change, but for completely changing the hearts of all men and pointing them towards salvation. Think about this. From that mustard seed, a few Jewish disciples 2,000 years ago in Palestine, we have churches here in the Chicago area, in Texas, in India, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. At one point, the Old Testament was in Hebrew and only read by the Jewish population, a small fraction of the world's population. But today, both Old and New Testament are translated into 698 different languages. Here's the thing. As a husband, I'm at the point where many times, especially when ordering or cooking food, I've learned what my wife likes and what she doesn't like. I've learned how she likes things. Like, for example, her eggs. She prefers them over easy. Her steak, she likes it medium well. If I say I'm making her eggs, I don't have to ask how she likes it because I know. And it kind of feels good when you know things like that, right? It kind of feels good that I know what she likes. But I can remember times before when I was still in Husband 101 where I assumed that Kelsey would like her steak medium rare, well, because that's the best way to get the maximum amount of tenderness and juiciness while ensuring that the center of the steak is still warm. At least it's the best way in my eyes. But that's not how she wanted it, and never gave me any indication that's how she liked it. We tend to do this with God. We make assumptions about how God should be based on what we think is right. And when we see God in that light, we really don't know who the God of the kingdom is. I want us to think about our assumptions about how God works in the world, or even how we think God ought to work in the world. We think extravagant, we think big, we think fast, that if he cared, he'd do things swiftly and on a grand scale. But Jesus is saying that's not it. That's not how the kingdom works. And if you think that's the only way he works, you're going to miss what God is accomplishing. Look all through the scriptures. God has accomplished great things in unlikely circumstances, in unlikely conditions, with unlikely people, and a lot of it didn't happen on humans' desired timing. Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 10 reminds us that we should never despise the day of small things. The gospel and the kingdom is compared to a small seed. But from that seed, something powerful sprouts. The power of the gospel can overcome all odds. It's brought unlikely people together. It's changed unlikely people's hearts. It's caused for people to go and do unlikely, awesome things. And oftentimes, rabbis and teachers would use the mustard seed as just a comparative of something diminutive, small, insignificant. What Jesus showed was that even a mustard seed can grow into something awesome. Think about this. You and I as the church today are living proof of the power of the kingdom. The kingdom is in fact powerful. And in no way in this parable is Jesus saying the kingdom of heaven is not powerful at all, but he's saying that its power cannot be measured by the human eye. But it's measured by what God has accomplished since before the foundation of the world. It's measured based on what Jesus has done in his death, his burial, his resurrection, and the saving power of humanity. A lot of times we say, how come God doesn't do things like parting Red Seas today or crazy things, big things, miracles, and so on and so forth? Because the greatest thing that all those things that we're pointing towards, the greatest thing that God can accomplish in human beings' lives is the change of the heart. There is nothing more amazing than that. Man, the Red Sea opened up. The children of Israel praised God, and what happened to them? They reverted back to, wait, God has never helped us at all. He brought us out here to die. That's what they reverted to. So even God knows, God ultimately knows that even just doing magnificent big things like that doesn't always change people. But the gospel does. The gospel is the power of God and salvation. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. It can change people in ways that you can never imagine. Let me tell you, I think it'd be cool to see the Red Sea opening up, but just seeing what the gospel has done in people's lives that I know, in my life, what could be better than that? And from a small mustard seed, that's what sprung forth. This parable reminds us that God can do amazing things in what we may measure as unlikely circumstances. The rest of the world, even Gamaliel, told the other members of the Sanhedrin, hey, if this Jesus is real, then we can't stop it. If he's not, then it's going to fade into obscurity. Christianity is still here today, across every continent in the world. Again, 2,000 years later, I grew up I was born in Queens, lived in Brooklyn, lived in Allentown, Pennsylvania, moved to Texas just out of high school, and now I'm here in Elgin, Illinois. Never would have I imagined going to all the different places that I did hadn't it been for the gospel message of Christ. I wouldn't know many of you who are watching this video right now if it weren't for the gospel, and if it wasn't for 12 unlikely men and a savior, the Messiah, who was seen as unlikely by the perception of the public. Where would we be today? Thank God for that mustard seed that sprung forth and produced a mighty, powerful plant in which you and I are a part of today, if you're a Christian, that is. Love you all. I hope that you all are enjoying this beautiful weather that we're having. I pray that you continue to enjoy it. And hopefully, Lord willing, we will on Wednesday night discuss more about this parable, look deeper into it, talk a lot about what the Word of God has to say on this matter that we're talking about, the kingdom today. God bless you all. I love you. And I pray that you all have a good rest of the day.